So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another week of the Global Cafe. As Luana shared, my name is Kara Cruz, and I'm a Senior Policy and Project Coordinator here at the IFA. Today, I am very excited to be introducing you all to Dr. Sophie Yarker and Dr. Luciana Lang, who will be joining us for a conversation on their research on the role of faith organizations on the development of age-friendly environments. Sophie is a lecturer in health geography at the University of Salford. She has a background in social and urban geography with research interests in social infrastructure, well-being in later life, and neighborhood change. Luciana Lang is an anthropologist whose research interests include age-friendly cities, a topic we're well familiar with here at the IFA, natural and cultural heritage, and community use of shared spaces, with a particular focus on green spaces. Her most recent project looked at how faith organizations support the age-friendly agenda in Greater Manchester, where she carried out an ethnography to investigate older people's participation in different faith spaces. So thank you very much, Sophie and Luciana, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. So to start off, before we begin a discussion on the report that you, Sophie, and Luciana both authored, Sophie, could you share with us the context of Manchester in regards to age friendliness?
Sure. Thank you so much, firstly, for having us here. We really appreciate it. And good morning and afternoon to everyone across the world. So I'm aware that a lot of people on the call will be very aware of the age-friendly agenda. But for those of you who aren't, I'll give a little bit of background and a little bit about the context in Manchester and Greater Manchester. So an age-friendly city or community is a place that enables older people to age well and have a good later life, a supportive environment for older people to live, work, and contribute to their communities and society in. And it's somewhere that supports older people to stay living in their homes and communities, hopefully for as long as possible, and to participate in the activities that they value and contribute to communities for as long as they can do. And so the Age Friendly Cities and Communities Network was developed by the World Health Organization to help us understand the different kind of contributing various aspects of an urban environment that can contribute to health and well-being in older populations. And it's a framework that provides some guidance to different stakeholders by looking at 8 different areas or 8 different domains, areas of concern in the creation of age-friendly cities and communities. And I think there is a link that can be shared kind of showing that the World Health Organization framework that you can refer to if you're not familiar with it. But these 8 domains are represented in what is sometimes referred to as the flower model. And it covers areas such as social participation, respect and social inclusion, civic participation and employment, communication and information, transportation, community support and health services, outdoor building spaces and buildings, and housing. And so we were really interested in thinking about like how maybe faith spaces contribute each of these areas. And this is kind of an ongoing area of work for Luciana and I and the research group that we're part of. So the City of Manchester joined the global network of age-friendly communities and cities in 2010, and the Greater Manchester City region joined in 2018, which means that they have an ongoing commitment to developing environments that are supportive of older people and considering these 8 different domains in their planning, development, and governance of their city and the city region. And so joining the network kind of really builds on a sustained work around age-friendly policy and development in Manchester and Greater Manchester, which has really seen the city region and the city itself become kind of quite a leader in the age-friendly cities and communities network. So that's some of the kind of policy background that we've been working around.
Certainly, thank you very much. And as many of the attendees here know, the IFA is an affiliate member of the Global Network, and really appreciating the contributions that Manchester has had to the network in terms of shared learnings. It's been fantastic. So going back to the project a little bit, what motivated you and your co-authors to start this project looking at the role of faith-based organizations in developing age-friendly environments?
Sure. So this particular piece of research on faith-based organisations is part of a larger project, which is funded by the Leverhulme Trust and is led by Professor Tina Buffel at the University of Manchester. And that project compares age-friendly policy in 7 different cities across the world. And one of those cities is Akita in the north of Japan. And we've been having ongoing discussions with colleagues in Akita about age-friendly work, and obviously in very different contexts, but coming up against very similar challenges as well. And through our conversations with them, it was really, that's where the kind of subject of faith-based spaces came up. And in Japan, Buddhist temples are very important spaces for older people, not just in terms of their spiritual well-being, but also as an important space in the community where people can socialize and meet with others. And through our conversations with Akita, we realized that whilst there was a wealth of research on the importance of the neighborhood for older people and the importance of particular spaces in that neighborhood to supporting older people's well-being, the role of faith spaces particularly is not one that's particularly well researched outside a kind of spiritual remit. So there's an awful lot of research, obviously, that looks at how having a faith can support older people's spiritual well-being. But we're really interested in what impacts they might have outside of the spiritual dimension, so kind of social and emotional and kind of more kind of social ties to communities. So that's kind of where our interest came about. So Akita in Japan did their own research looking at the role of Buddhist spaces, which is fascinating for older people. And so we wanted to kind of do similar research in Greater Manchester, obviously recognizing it's a very different religious, cultural society here. But also it connects, the kind of interest with faith-based spaces connects to another piece of research that Luciana were involved with during the pandemic, where we looked at how older people living in Greater Manchester were experiencing social distancing and experiencing the conditions of lockdown. And one of the themes that came out from that research was the huge role that religious and faith-based organizations played in supporting older people, not just with their spiritual well-being, but also with their social well-being, keeping people connected and providing support to other people in the community. So there's a few different strands to kind of how this kind of research has come about and developed our interests, I think.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, especially acknowledging the various roles, like you said, that different organizations that are founded on the basis of faith, but they provide much more than just that spiritual care. That's really fascinating. Thank you. So turning to Luciana, I understand that the project was very much kind of, it used a collaborative approach with community partners. So how did you identify and involve various stakeholders within Manchester to work with?
Yeah, well, thanks for your question, Kira. So, and thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to come here. So that's really good for us and to disseminate the research. So some of those stakeholders that came into this project have been involved with age-friendly work being carried out at University of Manchester for quite some time. And they had already proved to be really valuable gatekeepers when we conducted our research on social distancing that Sophie mentioned before, the one during COVID. And because the collaborative approach had been fruitful for all parties concerned, we were eager to continue working together. So it was a matter of catching up with those people again. And within the first 3 months of research, which was to start with a pilot research that we did, we conducted 5 focus groups with a total of 25 faith leaders. We interviewed 10 faith leaders, and we selected the 4 faith spaces for the ethnographic component of this research. So this would have not been possible without this collaboration. Yeah, so this is the dimension and the strength of having these collaborative partnerships. So this was more to do with the local partners, who were like valuable gatekeepers. And then at the national level, we had people from the Center for Aging Better, which also provided valuable guidance. And this was through the role in the advisory board. So as part of our collaborative approach, we had this advisory board with the partners who we met twice a year. And then we also formed a collaborative panel with some of the faith community members themselves. And that was really helpful to help us design the knowledge exchange events that we held throughout the project. So they helped us on informing with like the themes, what themes we should be working with. And this was made up of 2 representatives of each of the faith spaces that we worked with. Yeah, so we discuss various parts of the design of the research design with them. And then finally, also there was this involvement with Akita, which Sophie has already mentioned. So we had meetings with them about once every 7 weeks or 8 weeks. And that was, even though the Akita component was not part of our report, it kind of informed the research and made us think of things differently as well, taking a kind of that Buddhist perspective of that they were bringing to the project.
Fascinating. Just as a bit of a follow-up question, do you see kind of future work with Akita potentially, or kind of a comparative approach that you may take, or is that still?
Yeah, so this is being pursued in terms of papers, yeah, collaborative
Yeah.
papers with them. So yeah, so that's definitely going to happen, and we continue those meetings with them throughout the next year or so. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So on previous global cafes, we've spoken about the importance of knowledge translation and ensuring academics support their work in informing policy decisions. What motivated you to involve policymakers in this project, and did this change how you would have approached the project if it had entirely been led by academics?
Yes, so academics are well aware of the risk of working in silos, yeah, and generating knowledge that will only be read by other academics. So, you know, this is always something, a hurdle that we try to overcome. Hence the importance of applied research, yeah. And in times of austerity, with less resources being available for social infrastructures in general, the involvement with policymakers themselves facilitates the potential for research to have an effect on people's lives. Yeah. So I suppose that was like our ambition in terms of working alongside policymakers. And in terms of how this involvement affects research, I think I would draw on my own experience with working with Age Friendly Manchester, the team in general, and how Jason in particular helped me to keep my ambitions and expectations quite realistic, right? Because policymakers are working on the ground rather than the realm of ideas. Yeah. So we academics, you know, we might sort of think a little bit too ambitious for the concrete level of policymaking. Methodologically speaking as well, I think there is a lot to be learned from this exchange between academia and the public sector. So yeah, and in terms, I am still quite skeptical of the possibility of our research informing policymaking, but I think I'm going to leave it for Jason to talk a little bit more about this.
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for that comment about the various roles that we tend to take as, say, academics, the ideas that we really support and we want to see that happen, but then that grounding of, okay, well, what can we do and how do we really apply the research? So we have another member of the research team here today, Mr. Jason Bergen. So Jason, what was your experience working on this project from the perspective as a policymaker?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm kind of new to, well, I've done different levels of policymaking, but I'm new to the Manchester Age Friendly team, which sits in the City Council under Public Health and is a team. We do have quite a bit more capacity than most cities, and we've been doing this for 14 years under the under World WHO, but previous we had a Valuing Older People's program, which had been started by city councillors, recognizing there needed to be more to be done. So we actually matured this year. It's our 21st anniversary, I suppose, of the overall program. So I'll put something in about our strategy in the chat in a minute. But I guess for us, we were really, so I would just push back a little bit on Luciana's realm of ideas. I think many policymakers, we do try to do that, but some of us are informed by having worked in other areas, including academia. So I guess we look at it slightly different. But certainly, it's very true that in the challenges around austerity and austerity, then COVID, and cost of living, made this project very interested. We've had a long-standing relationship with the University of Manchester and other universities in Greater Manchester, I suppose, and try to do work together to have impact and to affect policy change. And this project was of interest because of coming out of as Luciana said, and Sophie, I think, alluded to the background of especially COVID and the cost of living, and recognizing that even in a big city where we do have more resources than others, the social and physical infrastructure is being shrunk. And so faith spaces have become a place where not just people of particular faiths only are meeting, but others are meeting, because it's a space that can be rented that might be cheaper than other spaces available, or those other spaces might not be available. But also, especially during COVID, it became, in Manchester and Greater Manchester, it was a place, these were spaces actually where we could reach communities and older communities that might be a bit more challenging because of their, not their faith necessarily, but their racialized backgrounds and things, that there were just spaces that if we could have our COVID testing centers and things there and inoculation centers there, these were helpful, and we did this more proactively and intentionally than I suppose had been done in the past. And in doing that, and then right on the back of that, I'm Canadian, so I know a bit about the cost of living in Canada, and I know it's been an effect in lots of places. In the UK, it's been particularly harsh in certain communities. So these two things happening together, when this proposal came to the council, we were quite keen to support it, because we thought we could help, and this could help us also to be a bit more intentional in how we work with faith communities. In Canada, I'm not sure if the same in Canada, but in the UK and other countries, but in the UK, we often refer to the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, but some councils in some areas put faith in there. So it's about voluntary community, faith, and social enterprise. In Manchester, generally, because we do have a quite diverse population, that's been used, but it's often used up as and when it seems appropriate. And in doing this work, it's become, the council has agreed this needs to be used much more intentionally, and also looking at how can we fund these things, these spaces and infrastructure a bit more. And also, there is sometimes miscommunication and perception from both sides about what you can and can't do. Of course, there are restrictions on all funding, generally, but the restriction that is perceived is not necessarily, and I think we would explain sometimes that restrictions on faith communities is just you can't proselytize, and it needs to be open to all as much as possible. Sometimes it's okay to just be with your community, even from a public sector funding, as long as there's certain things there, but it's like political funding. We can't fund something that's political. And if we explain it in that sense, and we're trying to be a bit more thinking about that. But I think, I think it was the social and physical infrastructure and how health and well-being can be addressed in other communities and in poorer communities and diverse communities, that faith spaces can really help to do that. And we also, vice versa, help them to keep their spaces going sometimes by renting them and using them as we can, because they also are struggling.
Thank you. And I like your observation of the intentionality of the relationship. I think that's important to acknowledge. I just want to turn briefly to a question from Shmuel. So Shmuel is a regular contributor to the Global Café. And he's asking about the role of faith-based organizations in improving the social well-being of older persons from poor or low socioeconomic groups. Do any of you have any comments on that?
Yes, I could. Thank you for your question. I think that is a really good question. And I think what we found is that faith spaces are very important to people in moments of transition, right? Now, this transition could be because of bereavement, because of divorce. It could be because of a change in circumstances and of financial challenges, that people will go through. So I'm not sure if I'm quite addressing your question, but I think it is. I think they are a force to be reckoned with when it comes to, in terms of supporting people in these moments of challenging times and moments of transition. And we found that was particularly the case for example, recent groups of recent migrants, people that have just arrived, and also things, groups of asylum seekers, people that are in a kind of a limbo for whatever reason and are going through financial hardships.
Thank you. So we've also had a question from Tom McCormick, who is asking which faith-based communities were involved. So I'll tie this into my next question a little bit. I'm sure the audience is eager to hear about your study findings. So kind of in answering what communities were involved, if you could also share what is the importance of faith spaces for older people or some older people within your study, and just kind of wondering if there was a variety of responses when you asked individuals from different faiths.
Okay, so 3 questions in one, right? So let
Yes,
me.
sorry.
So the first one is the faith. So
yes.
we selected 4 faith spaces. Yeah, so that was still at the pilot stage of the research, and it was to do the reason why we selected those 4 faith spaces was a result of the focus groups and of the interviews that we had, the conversations, and then also trying to have them more or less equally distributed between Manchester and Greater Manchester. So there were a few variables that helped us choose those 4 faith spaces. So it was a Pentecostal church, an Anglican church, a mosque, and a Hindu temple. Right, so those were the 4 faiths. Second question was, what were the key findings and why those places were important to people? So that's what I spent, the first 3 months of my ethnography doing, asking people, why do you come here? Why this place? Why not that other place? So why this particular Anglican church and not another Anglican church down the road? And things like that. And I think what was really striking is that a faith place is a home for people. Yeah, so those things that you find in your home that are important in your home, which is eating together, which is doing certain practices together, and the idea of family. So it's not by chance that in some of those faiths, people relate to each other as brothers and sisters, right? Because that is a family, is another family, an extended family. And for some people, which I came across in my ethnography on a few occasions, who have no family, who have no biological family, or are estranged from the families, or have moved away from the families, that is the faith family, is the actual family. And again, in those kind of contexts, the kitchen, for those faith spaces that can afford to have a kitchen, not all faith spaces can afford to have a kitchen, but the ones where we did ethnography did have a kitchen. The kitchen is also this really important hub for creating this family. And also another very important point of faith spaces is especially for those who belong to migrant groups, or even if it's like 2nd or 3rd generation of migrant groups, is that it is a place where they enact culture, where they can perform culture. So that is kind of the answer to the second question. And then the third question, please.
It was asking, was there a variety in responses when you asked individuals from different faiths, or was this a quite consistent pattern?
Yes, so there were many commonalities and there were many differences. So I'm going to just pick at one particular difference, is that because of this with migrant groups, faith overlaps with culture. So basically your faith is your culture and your culture is your faith. So there is a strong intersection there. So that faith becomes this place that is related to your cultural characteristics. So people often talked about things like, oh, I come to this particular church or this particular temple because of the style of worship, or because of the language, is it Gujarati, or is it, or is it another, or is it Hindi, or what language they speak, what type, what variation of language. So there is this idea of style of worship. That was a word that was actually used by a few of our participants. So this is with regards to those faith spaces that are made up of migrant groups, or whether first, second, or third generation. With regards to the Anglican Church, it was much more about the place itself and the church and the history, the biographies that were connected with that faith space. So it was often people that had been baptized there, christened there, married there, had their children christened there, and then had the funeral rites performed in that church. So there was this continuity over time and the bigger attachment to place. While with the other migrant groups, it was about appropriating an existing place, sometimes a church, often actually, a church that was then turned into a mosque or turned into a Hindu temple. Yeah, and they appropriate a place and make that a vessel for their kind of cultural practices. So that's some of the differences.
Fascinating, thank you. And also just making note to the audience that your report is in the resources shared by Luana, and will also be available following this conversation on the IFA's website. But I just wanted to follow up on my previous question. Did you find that there was a varied understanding amongst participants and respondents? Because I believe you had a survey component as well, regarding what it means to age well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so again, so there are again commonalities and differences. So what we worked quite a lot with the framework, yeah, with the age-friendly cities framework that proved to us a good methodological tool. And one of the knowledge exchange events that we had was focusing on the framework, and we had participants sort of editing out or trying to translate the framework into their own experiences, right? So that's one of the things that we did. And within that framework, the two petals for us if we use the flower model, which I think was shared, yeah, here. So the two petals that most spoke to people's experiences in faith spaces was connected to social participation and respect and social inclusion. Yeah, so these were really important. But similarly, in that exercise that we did with participants and in other conversations that we had, there was also this strong sense that there was something missing in the framework, that they did and exercised within their faith spaces, but that was not reflected there, which was to do with the spiritual, the importance of spirituality in their everyday lives of other people, for obvious reasons, right? So just to mention two obvious reasons, one of them is that people often intensify their faith practices after they retire because they have more time, right? And then, of course, you're more likely to come across some illnesses or physical challenges, or even the perspective of death, yeah, approaching. So this also makes people more involved with faith spaces and as volunteers, because you have to remember that the vast majority of the working force, the volunteering or working force of faith spaces are older people. Yeah, so this is general across all faith spaces that we visited. Yes, I think yeah, I think that's oh yeah, so yeah, just to finalize this, and so there was this missing this in the framework, the importance of spirituality and also the importance of belonging. Yeah, which again connects with culture and with place.
Yeah, it's hard because not like all of these things are interconnected, right? This idea of belonging, if you're a volunteer and you're being more connected with your community, it all kind of comes together. Thank you very much. Sophie, I might ask you to just kind of explain the age-friendly cities framework a little bit more. I understand that part of your research, you asked faith leaders and survey respondents about their familiarity with the age-friendly concept, and then shared the framework itself with the survey respondents. So could you remind our audience member what the 8 domains of the framework are, and share a little bit more on where, I guess, respondents felt that they were most supported by on the framework within faith spaces?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's probably just worth reiterating as well that whilst I mean, we work in research around age-friendly policy, and obviously work with policymakers who, it's their job too. It was quite interesting for us that we obviously have this huge awareness of it, but when we went to speak to religious leaders, faith, lay leaders, religious leaders in different communities, the level of awareness was relatively low. I think in our survey, particularly, we did an online survey of faith leaders from across different faiths in Greater Manchester. It was only about 50% had said they'd heard of the World Health Organization network, and I think about the same were aware, only about half of participants were aware that Manchester and Greater Manchester were part of that network as well, which is quite interesting for us. However, despite their low level of awareness of like the official concept, everybody we spoke to was very much in agreement of the need to support older people in their communities, and we're already doing a wealth of work to support older people in their communities and in their wider neighborhoods, even if they weren't part of the religious community as well. So low level of awareness of the concept itself, but a very high level of awareness of the need to support older people, and also a desire to know more about the framework and to find out how it could connect to their work and support their work, and what support they could get from other policy leaders and council leaders as well in doing that as well. So that was very interesting for us. And as a brief aside, the research in Akita found a very similar thing. There was a relatively low level of awareness of the concept itself, but a very high level of awareness of the need to engage with this kind of work, and we're already doing this work in various capacities as well. So like I say, we did a survey and we asked religious leaders where they felt that their work was already contributing to areas of the framework. And we did a similar exercise, as Luciana's mentioned, in a knowledge exchange event where we brought multi-faith leaders together. So it was an interfaith day of leaders, but also participants and kind of members of religious faiths and organizations. So it was an interfaith discussion about how their various spaces supported or contributed to the framework. And as Luciana said, we found the main area that people felt that they really contributed to, or religious spaces contributed to, was around social participation. And this was in a variety of different forms, just as a space of being somewhere and being visible and seen in a community, also being actively involved. As Luciana said, many of the people kind of running the organizations were either paid employees, older people, or they were volunteers as well. So older people having a huge role in kind of voluntary capacity in running these spaces, organizing them and running various organized activities in those spaces. We also found that many religious spaces faith-based spaces were running kind of non-religious activities or non-faith-based activities, such as coffee mornings, craft groups, different drop-in sessions, etc., which spoke to not just their religious community or the faith community, but the wider neighborhood community as well. So these spaces had a hugely important role in the neighborhoods as well. And then the second area that we found was like most relevant was around respect and social inclusion. So people of all faiths felt that their spaces had a huge role to play in providing respect and social inclusion for older people in their communities. And again, this was done in various ways for a lot of organizations. It was about intergenerational connection and providing a space of intergenerational connection and social interaction, but also intercultural, as well as Luciana has already mentioned, kind of the spaces reaching out into their wider neighborhood and having and connecting with other communities of interest and identity as well. Sometimes this was through organized events, but also was kind of done more informally as well. And then we also found that the other two kind of main domains that were really important or kind of came up as really important was providing a building and a space itself. And so having a building in the communities, particularly as Jason's talked about in the context of austerity, where in some neighborhoods, particularly low income neighborhoods, the religious space there might be one of the only parts of social infrastructure which is viable. It might be the only space to go and meet people or to hold events, etc. So recognizing that space is really important. And some of the spaces we worked with, although not all of them by any means, also had access to some form of green space, some form of garden or something associated with it, which again opens up huge potential opportunities for other engagement and just providing another space for older people to be. And then communication and information, again, was really important. And this was in a variety of ways, the space being used as a place where people could connect with others informally and be involved in informal networks of support and care and finding out information. Again, as Luciana just mentioned, this is really important for recent migrants and having a space to go and meet with peers and others who are in a similar situation to them, get advice about housing informally, but also more formal kind of ways of doing this as well. So we saw some examples of health services working in these spaces to deliver healthcare information and advice as well. So They were the domains, I think, that came up most strongly as where people already felt that they were making a connection to, even though they weren't maybe doing it officially under the banner of like a World Health Organization framework, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, and that idea of faith spaces being a community resource, seeing some reflections in the chat from Jane Teasdale and others about how that's impacted them and the organizations that they work with. So I have many, many questions, but I want to turn to the chat a little bit. Actually, Jason, I see you unmuted. Is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just say on that, also as it relates to the World Health Organization's framework, I think from our perspective, we often see all those things that I think Luciana and Sophie have said, but also the faith doesn't explicitly, and this was a discussion Luciana and I had a number of times, it doesn't explicitly fit under the framework, but implicitly it's there under like mental well-being and these social connections and these things. So similarly, you'll see, and if you look at our strategy very closely for Manchester, while we fit into the 8 domains, we actually do our strategy in sort of 4 main themes, which all cover off all 8 domains, but in terms of how we have to translate this with other policymakers and so that they understand it in that way. So while it's not so explicit, it is implicit. And I think that was, a lot of, and also it sort of broke some stereotypes where we just assume sort of that faith spaces will be very age friendly, and I think in the main they were, but there were some things that we maybe learned a little bit from each other. But also the thing about faith spaces is communications and social connection for people in the community. It was also something for us as policymakers. This is a place where we can also get information out, and we do need to be, as I said before, in more intentional in how we do that, because there is a lot of information available, and in good neighborhoods where there's good neighborhood and community development workers, those links are made, but we need to do more. And as Sophie said, austerity has affected a lot of these things in a lot of different ways. So
Thank you. Thank you for those additions. So on the topic of it's almost a missing domain, but not really. We've talked about spirituality and kind of how it maybe isn't integrated into the framework, but does exist in many of the domains. Tom McCormick has a question. So I might actually ask Tom if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, or I can ask it for you.
Yeah, hi. No, what I wrote was how, if at all, was the specifically spiritual dimension of these faith-based communities found to be significant? And then I thought I heard somebody say that you took a Buddhist orientation. Maybe I heard that wrong, just to clarify what was meant. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very encouraging.
Thanks so much, Tom. Sophie or Luciana, would you like to answer Tom's question?
I will just clarify the Buddhist orientation. So we didn't take a Buddhist orientation in this research. Where the kind of Buddhist dimension, I suppose, came from was we were working with partners in Akita in Japan. And so they were looking at like similar research around how Buddhism and Buddhist temples can connect to the age-friendly agenda there. So that was very much kind of their focus on it. We did, I think, speak to one member of the Buddhist community in the research, because as Luciana mentioned, there was 4 main religious spaces that we looked at in depth, but we also involved conversations with people from many other faiths in the research itself, and there was one Buddhist person within that. But yeah, the kind of Buddhist dimension was very much part of the research in Japan.
Thanks, Sophie. Luciana, do you have anything to add?
No, just that the reason why we did, I mean, there's always a reason why we didn't include one or another faith, but the reason why we didn't include the Buddhist faith on this one is because they didn't have a space as such in the context of Manchester, or at least with the people that we talked to, and we really wanted to do ethnographic work within the faith spaces. Mm-hmm. So as Sophie mentioned, we did do rapid ethnography, which means just like visits, one-day visits to to other faiths. So we talked to the Jewish community, we talked to Jehovah's Witnesses, we talked to Quakers, and and Catholic Church. So there were other visits, and but they were not part of our in-depth ethnography into these four faith spaces.
Could I just come back to the first
course.
question? You've mentioned the social, you've mentioned the cultural, you've mentioned the geographic, the buildings, the green space and such. And when you say faith-based communities, I think of a spiritual dimension. And I'm just wondering how specifically, if at all, that spiritual dimension played a role in what you discovered as the benefits.
Can I answer that, Sophie?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So it played. So this. Okay. So our framing. One thing that we as academics struggle with is to give like a very narrow framing to our research, because otherwise we go on 100 tangents, right? So it's really important to keep a tight framing. So our tight framing was spaces as faith spaces as social infrastructure. So in that sense, we were really, from the beginning, we were sort of making sure that we kept within spaces. So there were variations. So for example, within the Muslim community, we went to some domestic spaces that were transformed into faith spaces for a particular reunion of women, right? And I went and and took part in one of those rituals that they held in this domestic space. So this was turned into a faith space temporarily. So that was the only concession that we allowed ourselves as researchers, to come away from the faith space itself. So I hope that answered Tom's question.
Just a comment as an academic myself, I'm very concerned with everything that you're saying and understand kind of that culture of academia. And there does seem to be, though, a prejudice against, well, a filter against the spiritual per se. Just a comment and an observation.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, yes, I see. I do see your point. I do see a point, but it's the some of the straitjackets that we have to wear when we do research, in terms of our framing. But yes, I do see your point. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Luciana. So I have a question here from Parm Thind. So Parm was wondering if you could maybe explain some of the key performance indicators and metrics that you used when looking at the role of faith-based communities in developing age-friendly environments.
I can't really say that we used any specific metrics, or even I don't know that we had even an evaluation sort of framework looking at this. It was quite a qualitative kind of piece of work. So I'm not sure if she's asking, and because it was really time limited, we spent like the last year or a year and a half, I guess, doing some of this. But I can't say that we had anything specific. Sophie, help me.
I think as well, it wasn't the intention of the project to measure how well organizations or spaces were achieving age-friendly kind of criteria. That wasn't the intent. It was to kind of understand, or to get a sense of their understanding of it, how it might be furthered. And really, it was almost coming at it from a blank slate of, there is a particular maybe understanding of the World Health Organization's framework where it's most researched and used, which is maybe kind of more developed economies and in Western culture, but we're kind of thinking about how that's translates or is changed or is viewed differently when you look at it from a different cultural perspective, a different religious background perspective. So it was almost coming at it kind of asking the communities and the organizations involved, what do you feel that this framework could bring to your organization? How could it help support your work? But also, what is missing from it and why maybe wouldn't you engage with it, or what might be some problems around it, or how could we kind of shift the thinking around it a bit? There was much more kind of that kind of qualitative kind of approach of understanding the meaning of it, as opposed to trying to measure how well along the journey people were in achieving age-friendly status or meeting their criteria. It was kind of starting a bit further back, I think.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think age-friendly, there's no perfect way to do age-friendly. You do need to, it's kind of more suited, I would say, to a qualitative
but
evaluation.
and just coming back on that, but from our perspective from the city council, then we now have a better baseline of understanding. And there was a little bit of pushback because the broader survey was done across Greater Manchester, where age-friendly, the other 9 boroughs have had maybe less involvement with age-friendly. So we kind of were, well, can you disaggregate this down to tell us what did Manchester, was Manchester higher just because it's been around longer, but also recognizing that there's things that we can do so that we're both more aware of each other and doing more things together to help each other, because recognizing the role of these faith communities in supporting older people is a very important part if we want to achieve an age-friendly community overall, because it's not just what the council does, it's what we all do together.
Thank you for that, Jason. Sophie, do you have something you'd like to add?
I think maybe 2 more concrete examples of what emerged from the research that we found interesting that we weren't maybe anticipating was when we went to different communities and asked them what age-friendly meant to them or what they understood by it. Even the definition of age and older people was different in different communities. For some people, older person was much younger and some people was much older, and for different reasons. They connected with kind of biological age, health, physical health, also kind of wisdom and spirituality, etc., things like that. So the understanding of age and aging and older people was different. And even things like the domain around participation, which is one I'm particularly interested in. We were asking different communities about what older people participating in their communities meant. For some people, that meant them volunteering in the community where they lived and kind of giving something back to that community. For other people, particularly migrants, it meant giving something back or contributing to the community they've left at home. So in West Africa, for example, and about kind of contributing to the communities and society they left there. So yeah, just kind of thinking about how the domain of participation was interpreted was very different when we spoke to different communities. So that was that's the main thing we were interested in discovering, I think.
Thank you. And on that theme of social participation and contribution to communities, Emily Greenfield has a really fascinating question. So we'll give her the chance to unmute if she would like to ask it, or I can ask it. Emily, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for this global conversation. It's really enriching, and big fan of the report even before the meeting this morning. I just wanted to ask, in the US context, we find that our age-friendly champions who kind of represent the whole of a jurisdictional place are super eager to partner with faith-based organizations because they understand their civic value, the importance of them as part of the fabric of the civic community, but especially in terms of reaching historically excluded populations, or kind of this idea of like sub-communities, communities within communities. And we have found that there's kind of mixed success. It's not as straightforward or as easy as an ask. Oftentimes there can be just a lot of capacity issues within faith-based organizations, like they don't have a lot of extra staff. Their faith-based leaders are tasked with taking care of their own community and just don't have like extra time to go to extra coalition meetings or be responsible for one more thing. And then increasingly, just being asked by a lot of different community groups, not just age-friendly, for them to partner on things of civic value. And so I'm just wondering, from your cross kind of cultural national project, if those things came up around some of the challenges and barriers of building authentic partnerships and attending to issues of kind of power and capacity and building out those networks in the name of age-friendly.
Thank you, Emily. Really appreciate your question and reflections. Sophie or Luciana, would you like to take first bat at the question?
Thank you, Emily. That's really interesting, important question. Yes, so you're absolutely right. So though they are overburdened with things to do, and they're already, some of them having to cope with not a lot of people resources in terms, in the case of Anglican communities, the demographics is aging and they don't have a lot of volunteers. In cases of other faith spaces, of having financial resources sort of diminishing, so they have to really split themselves between what, who can do what. So yes, so we did. So there was, for example, it took us a little bit longer to find a mosque to work with. In the end, we found a mosque that was actually one quite challenged by, financial pressure, but they were so eager to contribute that they were very keen on learning from the project, etc. But one point that I wanted to make, and I made that point actually, I think in yesterday's presentation, is that we were very concerned from the word go that we had to think about what's in it for them. Yeah, so what are they going to get out of this collaboration rather than us as researchers just going there and getting stuff out from them. And I think that because we had this concern throughout the project, we found that there were ways that we could help each other. So one of the things that we did was to hold our events, our knowledge exchange events within faith spaces. So the three events were held within a different faith space. So once the Pentecostal church, once the Hindu temple, and once the mosque. And then we pay them for the use of the space and for the food that they provided. Yeah. And for in the case of the mosque, also for the chanting that they provided as part of the event. So that was one way that sort of we were giving back to the faith community. But I think, well, we think that they said they got a lot out of the project by having the possibility of exchanging in interfaith manner. Yeah, so people were there was a lot of appetite for more interfaith connection, and this was presented to us as something that they got out of it. And this happened in quite a few different occasions. So, for example, we saw sort of cross communication between different faith spaces about going for walks together, doing of working in the green space of another community, another faith community that didn't have a green space. Yeah, so there was like some contribution there. And really a lot of appetite to learn about other faiths practices, and and what they ate and how they performed the rituals. So this, I don't know if in some ways answer your question, Emily. I think is about finding ways, and you have to find that by engaging with people, and that's where the value of ethnography, I think, really is highlighted. Finding ways that the research can be beneficial to the communities.
Thanks so much, Luciana. And yeah, really liking your observation of how the research created that opportunity for connection, because I think having a shared action or a shared activity, that's really what establishes the possibility of a relationship. Certainly. So thank you. We're very quickly running out of time today. I see there are many questions in the chat and comments and reflections. So thank you, everyone, for that. I wanted to ask you both quickly before we start to conclude, if you could speak a little bit more about your research recommendations, so recommendations to policymakers as well as those within the faith communities.
I can go through. So we had two sets of recommendations, as you said, which are outlined in the report. One is around recommendations to service providers, funders, and policymakers, which I'll speak a little bit to. I won't go through all of them, but I think a lot of our recommendations were kind of built around, firstly, trying to recognize the work that is already going on in these spaces to support older people in their communities, and then thinking about how that can be supported, further enhanced, I think. And again, some of that goes back to kind of sharing ideas of different examples, as Luciana's mentioned, that was facilitated throughout the research. Some of it is about kind of thinking more widely about how this can be taken further forward. So I think firstly, one of the kind of groups of recommendations was exploring how to enhance the role of faith spaces in promoting health and well-being for older people, and however that might be defined. So that might be kind of further supporting connections between religious organization spaces and health services. So perhaps through activities such as social prescribing, although there's other models and examples as well, but really thinking about how health and well-being and those services can use those spaces as a way of accessing different communities, as Emily's already mentioned, and kind of getting health information and activities and advice out into different communities, but also kind of thinking about the dialogue the other way as well, and using faith spaces as a way of service providers understanding the needs of different communities a bit more as well. So secondly, thinking about recognizing the role of faith spaces in supporting people through different transitions, as Luciana mentioned at the top of today's discussion. So supporting older people through challenging periods in their life, such as bereavement or different kind of transitions, such as becoming a recent migrant. And looking at how we can support spaces to provide more, act as like a signposting space for different services, accessing different information, advice and support for members of religious communities, but also for members of the wider neighborhood in which people live in as well. And then finally, recognizing these spaces as really important points of connection, or really important points of social infrastructure, and encouraging funders and service providers to support ways of bringing these organizations together, and particularly around interfaith events and kind of interfaith communication and exchange of knowledge, as Luciana's mentioned as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sophie. And like you said, more thorough kind of overview of the recommendations can be found in the report. So Luciana, really quickly, would you be able to share kind of information on recommendations to those supporting faith communities?
Yeah, sure. There is a lot of overlap with the recommendations to stakeholders. So quite a few of the things Sophie had mentioned already. But I'm going to just focus on two in particular. One of them is the need for more communication regarding funding, especially for those faith communities that have to just use the community funds to be sustainable over time. So one of the ways that one of the recommendations is about, I don't know how you can relate to that in Canada and in other countries, but here we have the Voluntary and Community and Social Enterprise acronym, the VCSE. Yeah, so whenever you talk about, funding available, etc., to these organizations, but the idea, one of the recommendations is to have a more systematic use of F for faith within the acronym, so that we have, so that we encompass so we say voluntary community, voluntary faith and community and social enterprise as this part of this acronym for organizations that need or are eligible for funding. And then the other point, because I know that we have a minute left, is related to this untapped potential of green spaces, of working with green spaces that are either next to faith spaces or in the neighborhood, because we found that there is a lot of appetite for that, and that can be super beneficial for older people as they age, both in terms of mental health and physical health.
Yeah, and creating also a better environment for us all as well. So thank you both so very much. I'm going to quickly introduce next week's topic. So Luana will be sharing our tile. So please join our discussion next week, where we will be joined by Kim Samuels on building connection to the 4 Ps: people, power, place, and purpose. And that will be moderated by my wonderful colleague, Mitali Mystery. So thank you so much, Luciana and Sophie and Jason, for being so generous with your time today. Before we sign off, a huge thanks as well to all of our audience. You're all fantastic. You make getting up early on a Friday worth it, certainly here in Toronto. And an additional thanks to my colleagues at the IFA, especially Luana Calnigo. So I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and looking forward to seeing you on future editions of the IFA Global Café.